You ready to roll?
Ready?
Okay, okay, I think we got the slideshow shared. Well, my name is Mark Weicker. I'm with Albite Weicker, and this is the special education legal clinic that we do in conjunction with Disability Rights Ohio and the Ohio Coalition for the Education of Children with Disabilities. Today we have Danielle Randolph, who's going to be doing the workshop. The workshop title is Progress Reports, Data-Driven Goals, and Recovery Services. And we're also joined by Eileen Brock from Disability Rights Ohio. And the three of us at the end of this workshop around 10 o'clock will do a Q&A panel discussion. So you're welcome to ask questions throughout the workshop by dropping those in the Q&A, but you'll also have time for that half-hour window from 10 to 10:30 to ask any of us questions about this workshop or other special education related matters. So it's open for that reason. And this is the, I think, fifth in a series of workshops that Danielle and I have done. And next month we'll have number 6, and then in December we'll have number 7. And the clinics are always held on the second Saturday of the month, at least through the end of this year they will be. And they are always held, the workshops always start at 9 o'clock. So next month will be transition, which is number 6 in the series. I think that's it for the introduction. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Danielle.
All right. Good morning, everybody. So like Mark said, this is you said 6th, right? So yeah, we're chugging along over here. So we've already talked about IEPs and what makes a good IEP. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into those data-driven goals, progress reports, and recovery services. I think I touch on maybe ESY and compensatory education as well, which kind of all I think goes into a pot of services that are owed to a child. So we are going to start with, I believe, data-driven goals. Yes, we are. All right. So one of the first steps in developing a measurable goal is to collect data that tells the team what your child is currently performing. So that's called baseline data. You have to know where you're starting to be able to have a good goal, to know where you want to end. So it's really important that we collect that data. And sometimes I'll sit in a meeting and we'll talk about things the child needs, and we might throw out things that could potentially be good goals, but if there's no baseline data to start with, then you really can't write a goal. So it's important to know that you have to start somewhere. When we say measurable goal, that's what we're talking about. You have to have data, you have to have information to start with that you can then track along the way to make sure your child is progressing. Now, this information is in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, or sometimes we call it the plop of the goal, which is the very first box of your goal. And that information talks about where your child is. Now, you should ensure that there is enough data, again, to support that goal, and additional assessments may be necessary. So sometimes, especially with an initial IEP, you may not have a lot of information to really go off of when you write that goal. So as a team, you may talk about collecting additional information, whether that's through rating scales, curriculum-based assessments, observations, whatever it may be. So there may come a time where you sit in a meeting and you talk about a good goal, but you need to collect more information to have a good measurable goal, and maybe you need to re-meet later. So that may occur, and that's perfectly fine because you want to make sure you have that data. Oh, all right. So here's an example of a good data-driven goal. And so we're talking about reading fluency in this goal. And so they typically write a goal for an entire year. So for the life of that IEP. And so by October 2022, when given an 8th grade level passage, so we're talking about the grade level that we're measuring the student on, time for 1 minute. So again, there's another piece of data. So we know the child is reading this passage for 1 minute. That child will read 114 words correct per minute with 95% accuracy. Now, some goals are written for a 100% accuracy, but we all have off days. So a lot of times you're going to see the goals written to allow for that off day. So we have 95% accuracy and 3 out of 4 opportunities. And they say how they're measuring that. So they're going to use curriculum-based assessments or running records. And so you have all that information in that goal that you're looking for. You know what the aim is, what the goal is, right, to the end, because that individual is going to use the same fluency read or a very similar fluency read that is on that 8th grade level, that is timed for 1 minute, to measure that word per minute to see where your child is progressing.
Danielle,
Yes.
we got a question that was sent in by email, I think is appropriate now. You stayed in this goal, by October 2022. And the question that we received before the workshop was, should there always be a stated time limit on each goal? So for the semester or the year or otherwise?
Yeah, and typically it may say by the end of the IEP, but yes, there has to be, you have to know what your end goal is. I don't know if I've ever seen a goal written for less than the life of that IEP, because down below, when you have your objectives or your benchmarks, if you're benchmarking something, then usually you're saying by the first 9 weeks they're going to be here, by the second 9 weeks they're going to be here to reach that goal. So that's where you would see maybe a breakdown of specific timeframes that are less than that IEP year, but typically it's for the life of that IEP.
Thank you. And another question that came in that I think is relevant now is, can you explain what CBMs are, or curriculum-based measures?
Yeah, so curriculum-based measures or curriculum-based assessments, those could be so if we're talking about reading fluency, so you have a reading passage, and so it's based on the curriculum that your child is receiving, and so it ties back into that. It's not standardized necessarily, so it's not which I think I go into a little bit more, but it's not like a MAP or an Ames Web or a STAR, which are standardized. It's not going to be information that they receive probably from their ETR. It's something that the teacher is going to do with your child, usually one-on-one, to measure where they are based on their grade level standards or compared to the grade level peers.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. So again, the baseline data are present levels. You want to make sure that we know where your child is starting from. So we want to make sure that it's stated very clearly. So in this particular example, the student demonstrates reading fluency skills that are below grade level expectations. So we know that maybe they're not to where they need to be, and that maybe is our goal, to get them up to grade level. So it may say in that present levels that they were benchmarked, when they were benchmarked, what tool was used, and then where they were. So in that plot, again, you want specific information to go off of. I think my biggest struggle sometimes when I sit into an IEP meeting is to look at a goal which lacks data or has no data. And so we'll go into that a little bit more, I think, in a few slides down the road, but what you really want in that plot. You can go next, Mark. Thank you. All right. So baseline data can include any of the following. So you can have assessment data from the ETR, especially if this is the initial IEP, which is coming right off of that ETR. A lot of times that's really what's going to drive that IEP goal, because the IEP has to be tied to the ETR. So you might have assessment data from the ETR, the curriculum-based measures like running records, work samples, behavior data sheets. So if you have a behavior goal in that IEP, then a lot of times you're going to see that. You're going to see, specific like frequencies of behavior or time samples of behavior. That should all be in that plot. You're going to 9 times out of 10 see MAP, STAR, or Ames scores. So whatever that district is using, usually it's 3 times a year. You can request for it to be done more frequently with your child, but 3 times a year, you're going to have some sort of standardized assessment that's comparing them against their same age peers within that school building. And then data from previous IEP goals or progress reports. So if this is not your child's first IEP, they've already had an IEP, then a lot of times you're going to see how that child did maybe on a previous goal that was measuring a similar topic or similar subject. What you don't want to see is a goal that is verbatim what it was last year. That's a problem. If you see that, then you need to ask a lot of questions, because that tells me that the child did not make progress in the last goal. And why didn't they make progress? And I would be, I guess, questioning the validity of the goal that was written to begin with. Maybe we were, aiming too high, or what was going on with that goal. So you never want to see the same goal repeating itself year after year. You should be seeing some difference. Now, of course, it may be measuring the same area, like reading fluency or math calculation, if your child's still struggling in that area, but it should change as your child gets older and achieves hopefully those goals or objectives on the previous IEP. The plot should never be strictly observations, grades, state test scores, or opinions. Again, we want data. We want something that we can say, yes, here's where your child's starting. Not, this is my subjective opinion about where your child is. That should not be in the plot. I mean, you may have some observational data, and that's okay, but the goal should not strictly be based off of that. You definitely want to have data to support that goal. If you don't see the link or the apples to apples comparison between the present level and the goal, then this is something that the team needs to be talking about. Because again, baseline data is going to drive that goal. So the goal should be based off of that data. You shouldn't have present level information and then have a goal that's measuring something totally different. That would be a problem. And it's the data in the present level and the measurable IEP goal that makes it possible for us as the IEP team to write meaningful progress reports and measure your child's progress. So again, when you look at the measurable goals, the term measurable, you need to be able to measure it somehow and determine if they're making progress. So when you get those progress reports, you should be able to see your child being assessed with the same tool, with the same sort of goal in mind. Again, the words per minute. So we would be looking at a grade level passage. Again, that passage is probably going to change because you don't want your child to get used to that grade level passage, but it's going to be very, very similar with the words per minute and the grade level that we're going to be timed the same. So again, we can really measure how your child's progressing.
Danielle, we have another question. Can parents ask, or should parents know how progress will be measured when the IEP is first implemented or when the IEP is first amended? Should they know before they get their progress reports? So should they know when the goals are first adopted? I think is the question.
Well, you have little check boxes underneath your plot where they check how they're measuring it. And if you're unclear about what that means, because sometimes I am too, what is a work sample? What does that mean? Ask those questions. And I do have some clients where we ask for those work samples, or we ask for those curriculum-based assessments. So those are part of your child's educational record. You can absolutely ask to see those to be able to get a better understanding of how they're measuring your child's progress.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so progress reports. They are reported whenever a grade card or an interim is issued. So if your school district does interims 4.5 weeks, then you should be getting a progress report every 4.5 weeks. Some districts are 9 weeks, some are 10 weeks. Whenever they issue grade cards, this is your child's IEP grade card, if you will. So you should receive the IEP progress report at the same time you receive a grade card. If your child gets a grade card, or let's say his or her sibling gets a grade card and you haven't seen a progress report, certainly ask your child's IS to see that. It is essential that the baseline data be provided for each objective. So when you see that progress report, you should be able to see how they're progressing on each objective as well as the goal. And a lot of times you'll see, I think, in my opinion, when I see progress reports, you'll see more information under those objectives versus the overall goal, because that's really what you're measuring, those objectives to hopefully reach that goal. So you want to make sure though that you see that information present on that progress report. It's how the progression and regression can be measured. So when we talk about extended school year services, or ESY, that's what we're going to be looking at, is those progress reports and how your child is progressing. And I don't know if now would be a good time to show. Yeah, we'll pull it up if you don't mind, Mark. So I have an example that we've redacted the student's name, but in my opinion, it's a really good example of something you can ask from your district to have a better, clearer understanding of how your child is being measured. And so for this particular child, we would get progress reports coming home that would say they're making adequate progress, which I'm sure you see that a lot. What does adequate progress really mean? And what kind of terms does that look like? And you read these and you have all this information, which is good. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's a lot of information to digest. And if you are like me, I'm a visual person. I want to see graphs. I want to see that information. So if you scroll down a little bit, Mark, with this child, we asked for the IS, which I'm sure she probably wasn't too happy about, but we asked for her to give us a graph. Okay, right there. Thank you so much. So this shows us each time that child was progress monitored. And so we're able to see a graph. And then if you scroll down a little bit more, Mark, she has written what the baseline data was. So for this goal, it was 15. And then each time he was progress monitored, we see what that number was. Now the on track goal met, I believe there was one instance down here, which I was questioning if it was really on track, but nonetheless, we're able to really see with clear data how that child was doing. And if you scroll to the next page, Mark, at the bottom, there you go. Thank you so much. Oh, we have the target. So we have the baseline, we have all of these inventories, and then we have the target. So we know where we started, we know how he has done, and we know where we ended. So to me, this really shows if that child was making adequate progress. And again, what adequate progress really means. Now, did he meet the goal? No. But when we start at 15 and then towards the tail end of that goal, we're ending at 1s and 2s and 3s, that's pretty good progress. And so there's no reason why you can't ask your IS to do this. Again, it's more work and they may not be too thrilled about it. But as a parent, you can absolutely request this because you want to know how your child is doing. And reading all these words, again, it's great information. But in my opinion, it gets a little messy and sloppy and you're really not sure what that means and what that looks like. And so when you're looking at extended school year services or you're looking at writing new goals, this data would really help you develop those new goals or determine if your child is not progressing and needs that ESY. And so this was just another goal that we asked them to do. I believe this was maybe being on task. So it was I think a 0 or a 1, like 0 he wasn't on task, 1 he was, or something like that. But again, we're able to see how he's doing with that goal. So I just wanted to show that as a visual of something that you can ask. You can always ask for a district to do more.
And I should point out too that the charts were a little easier to read because they were in color, but we didn't scan them in color. So it was more helpful than it shows here.
Yeah, so I love this, and I tell the IS many times how much we appreciate that she would do this, and honestly, we're able to get the SLP on board to do it too. So it was really beneficial for that child. So progress reports, they should include the goals, the objectives, a summary of the measurable data used to access the student's progress, or assess, instead of access, it should be assess, the student's progress. Any sort of comments from the IS related service provider when they were collecting the data, and then a description of your child's progress toward meeting the goal in measurable terms. So that's why I said it's a lot of verbiage. It's all good information. Don't get me wrong. And you want all of that information. But again, I think trying to understand where your child is and how they're progressing kind of gets lost in the words, in my opinion. So progress report should be, again, separate for each objective. Ideally, you want at least 3 data points, which to me, that's low. I mean, we're talking a whole year for that IEP goal, but you should certainly at least have 3. But if you want to show consistent progress, I would definitely ask for more. I would love to see once a week, but I would say once a month or once every 6 weeks, I suppose could be okay. But you want to, because sometimes I see if the goal is 75%, then they hit that 75% twice out of the 3 and they say, yep, they met the goal. Let's move on. But really, was it sustainable? Were they able to, apply whatever they were learning with that SDI to the classroom? We don't know. We only have 3 data points. So you should at least have 3, but I would absolutely ask for more. There's no reason to not ask for more. And make sure that the measurement is the same tool that was used in the present levels of performance. Make sure that's the same tool that's used continuously throughout that IEP, so the goal itself can be measured back to that baseline data. Because if they're 2 different things, and you're really not going to be able to compare where they started and where they ended. So if, again, we want to see comments, we want to hear comments on how your child is doing. So comments can include the number of times during the period the student was assessed. So that should be pretty clear to you how often they were assessed, which manner they were assessed in. So was it small group? Was it whole group? Was it one-on-one? Was it in the morning? Was it in the afternoon? Some students we know do better in the morning or the afternoon. If that's your child, then we should make sure that they're assessed when they're best and the brightest that they can be. What type of goal-related assessment was used? And any specific issues that may have impeded that progress. So if your child was assessed today, but they came to school in a really bad mood, that should be stated in there. That maybe it wasn't a great day to collect data. Honestly, they probably should have just done it the next day. But if anything like that happened, or if a fire drill went off while they were doing it, that should be noted in here, just so you know. If it's a little bit lower, a little bit higher, whatever it may be, there may be a reason behind that. So a description that your child's progress toward meeting the goal in measurable terms. So right, as you can see in that verbiage, we can see the days that they were assessed, what data was collected, how it was collected. So all that information is right here. You shouldn't be ever questioning these things on how your child was assessed and what information was from that, what came from that assessment. You shouldn't have to guess or ask. It should all be there in measurable terms in clear, concise language. So like I had said about the progress reports, when we look at progression and regression for ESY, so we're going to touch on ESY for a second, because extended school year services, I feel like it's something that districts sometimes gloss over and don't give a lot of time to explaining to parents. ESY is not summer school. Some kids benefit from summer school or tutoring over the summer, and that's great, but that is not what ESY is designed for. It's only for those goals where your child showed regression and was not able to recoup that information in a timely manner. So it's goal specific. It's not my child gets ESY for all goals in the IEP because they get ESY. It's very goal specific. And you're looking at your child not growing, not regaining that information after a long break, or honestly, if your child is just not growing to begin with. So a lot of times we hear the regression recoupment, which is falling back and not regaining. But if you see your child is just not growing and not gaining with that goal, in my opinion, that is an appropriate time to ask for ESY, because obviously whatever was provided to your child wasn't enough to show that growth. So again, good conversations to have. Never let your district gloss over this section. I mean, if your child is doing amazing, that's great. They probably don't need ESY. But if you're questioning, over summer break, over winter break, over spring break, or even over a long weekend, if you see your child has to come back and sort of start back to where they were, that's a problem.
Danielle, we have a question. Does ESY necessarily come in the summer, or can it be added on like at the end of the school day?
So ESY typically would be over the summer or over winter break or over spring break. Typically would be over a break period, because that's what we're saying. We're saying that over these long breaks, your child is not able to keep up with the progress they were making. Now, other services that we're going to touch on, like compensatory educational recovery services, those can be added onto your school day. But ESY is, again, it's provided during those breaks to prevent that regression. So that's why it's typically done during the breaks.
Got it. And one other question that came in about ESY is, so can you give us an example of what that might look like? Like, so what, the meeting with the student would look like?
So some districts already have existing setups for ESY. So maybe a 6-week time period in the summer where they have therapy providers coming into the district to provide therapy, so speech, OT, PT. It could be that they have an intervention specialist that's going to come to the home, perhaps, to provide those academic supports. I mean, I think it just depends, but I will say a lot of districts seem to already have sort of existing setups with ESY that they kind of just plug your kid in. But typically it's not going to be, once a week for the entire summer. It's usually kind of, I think, sort of clumped together and maybe a 6-week time frame. Now, I will tell you, I did have a preschool kiddo last year, and we were able to get him, so someone came to the house every Friday, but that's because he did not get a one-on-one aid like he was supposed to throughout the summer. Therefore, we felt like he wasn't able to grow with his speech and social skills. So because the entire school year, it was kind of, I guess, more comp is why, but either way, it's very student specific and goal specific. But a lot of times you're not going to see it every week throughout the summer. It's going to be during a certain period of time.
And last question from the same person, can ESY be goal specific? So related to, let's say, a reading goal or a writing goal?
Yes, it's always goal specific. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, so the IEP team needs to consider any adverse impacts of COVID-19. So we all lived through the pandemic, right? It was awful. So the 1920 school year, we were, toward the tail end of that school year, we were all at home. And then last school year, some schools never went back. Some schools went back and then had to come back out for virtual instruction. Some schools were on hybrid. A lot of things were happening last year as well. And so we need to be able to have that conversation with our school district about any adverse impacts of COVID-19 on your child with a disability. And some of these things, as I've noted in this little bullet right here, could be different. So maybe because of the pandemic, your child is now experiencing some additional social emotional difficulties, or maybe some behavioral difficulties because they were at home and it was less structure. And so we're seeing an increase of behaviors. Maybe they had COVID and they have that, what do they call it? I don't know, that long-term syndrome. We're still dealing with medical issues because they had COVID. So there may have been, what was it?
Long COVID.
Oh, long COVID. Okay. I thought I had a better name than that. So there may be new, oh, my battery is running low. Oh, goodness gracious. I thought I was plugged in. So I got it. So there may be some additional needs that popped up from the pandemic that needs to be addressed now in that IEP that you may not really have a lot of baseline data to go off of, except for maybe parent report. You may need to do additional data or collect additional data to support a goal. But that's important for the team to consider. Also consider any lost skills or a lack of expected progress. If your child was making good progress, but then you saw, well, hey, when they had to go home and do virtual, they weren't making as well, they weren't making good progress anymore. Again, important conversations to have. You also need to discuss any sort of compensatory education. The school failed to provide a service. So I saw a lot with therapies, with PT and OT, because they couldn't really do it virtually. And they weren't going to go to a parent's or a student's house. And so it just wasn't provided. So those are minutes that need to be made up by the school district. Now, those minutes can absolutely be during your child's school day. If they already have, we'll just say 120 minutes of speech, and they didn't get speech, then you can just tack on that to say, 180 minutes a month or whatever it may be. So that is where you would tack on that time during your child's school day or at the end of the school day, and whatever it may be.
Danielle, we have a question related to that. Okay. The question is, what if you determine that the child is eligible or needs compensatory education, but the amount of therapy or supplemental support would be, overwhelming for the child?
Then I would try to have that conversation about how we can spread it out so it's not so overwhelming. And IDEA doesn't really talk a lot about compensatory education. They don't give you a specific time frame or amount of services that need to be made up. So it's very, I don't know. I think it's a little subjective when it comes to school districts and states trying to interpret what compensatory education looks like. And maybe as a parent, you say, hey, I'm well aware that my child didn't get that service. Can we maybe look at providing it over the summer instead of during the school year? So I think those conversations can be open and honest with the team. I will tell you, I haven't run into many districts who have pushed back when they clearly know they did not provide the right services. So I think that school districts have been pretty favorable in providing these services for children that didn't receive it.
Got it. And a question just came in through the Q&A. What happens if a parent decides to homeschool the child because of lack of COVID-19 protocols and doesn't feel safe sending the child to school?
What happens in regard to?
I guess maybe generally with IDEA would be the first point.
Well, once you homeschool your child, you withdraw them from the public school and you no longer are entitled to FAPE. So that is kind of a whole nother conversation, because once you withdraw them, it's no longer the school district's responsibility to ensure that your child is growing. So
So I guess tied to this conversation, then they wouldn't receive progress reports because they wouldn't have an IEP, right?
correct. Yeah.
Got it.
So recovery services, this is it's like a little bit of compensatory education, a little bit of ESY. But so IDEA does not define recovery services. This was a term that came out from the state of Ohio. I also don't know, Mark. Was it nationwide? Maybe it was just Ohio. Was it nationwide?
Yeah, it's some districts around the country were retitling it. Recovery services was one of them. That's what Ohio used, but there was another term that other states and school districts and states have used. But yeah, Ohio, this is what they called it, the makeup time for COVID loss services.
Right. So recovery services was specific to COVID-19. And recovery services it's a little bit different because it can be provided to any child who fell behind. It is not specific to children who have disabilities. And so I saw a lot of schools over this summer and the previous summer who offered tutoring services to all kids who needed it and any parent who opted into it. So really it is for all of the learners that had educational gaps due to the unexpected school closings, or again, when they were virtual. But recovery services can be provided obviously to kids who do have an IEP. But it would look more like that, I guess, compensatory education. The difference between those two is comp ed is a district saying that I'm well aware it's not provided FAPE to your child. It's them admitting that they had some wrongdoing, if you will. Recovery services is kind of like, hey, the state shut down. That wasn't us, but we'll provide some services to help your child.
There is a comment which I think is important. A child can have an IEP when they're homeschooled, which is correct. So the school district's still responsible for writing the IEP, but when you're excused for homeschool, they're no longer responsible for servicing the IEP. So I think that's an important distinction that somebody made here. And you can then, once the IEP is written, then you can take it, and some people do, to a private school or a service provider to have them service the IEP, and using either autism or John Peterson scholarship funds to do that. So I think that's an important distinction. So the local school district still responsible for child find, to identify the student with disability, and to draft an IEP. But as soon as you're excused, that student, then you're no longer, that school district's no longer responsible for servicing or providing the services under the IEP. Good comment by somebody attending here. Next slide.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's on to me.
Okay.
Just making sure. Let me look at the questions before we move on. All right, I think we've got all the questions. So the only, with this slide, I just wanted to point out that there was some recent guidance by the U.S. Department of Education, and this is, it's actually through OSERS, and OSEP is a division of OSERS, but the guidance just came out in September, and in particular, Part D of the guidance, I think, was instructive in regards to compensatory education. And then there's also a section, Part E, on ESY. I think Danielle hit on most of it, but regarding updating and reviewing the IEP, the Department of Education just reiterates that IEP teams must consider, the impact of the pandemic, lost skills, lack of expected progress, updating the data to make sure that the present levels are accurate. And then whether the child needs additional services, behavior, social, emotional, mental health, and then considering whether to implement COVID-19 prevention measures or the implementation of those prevention measures like masking and distancing will be a challenge, and how you might need to address that through the IEP. So it just reiterates that those things should be considered when updating any IEP at this point, coming out of the pandemic, assuming that we are coming out of the pandemic. And then question D5 or explanation D5 in the same document says that regarding compensatory education, it indicates that teams should consider present levels, the child's previous rate of progress toward goals, and then the frequency and duration of special education related services provided prior to the service disruptions caused by the pandemic, and then anything that was missed during the pandemic. So it just, again, reinforces the notion that IEP teams should be considering all of these things for every child, coming out of this pandemic. And I wanted to share one thing here too. I like to remind everyone that on this page where you register, so this is lawyersforstudents.com/legal clinic. This is the page that kind of outlines what we do here at the clinic. And then at the bottom where the registration is, there is something here. First, we have a research page, which I think is very helpful for parents. But on the resources page, I have added, among other very helpful things that are developed by us and DRO and OCECD, I have added this, let's see, return to school roadmap. So it's available here, and specifically based on what we're talking about, parts D and E are very helpful to read and understand for parents and educators. Just wanted to share that. And that's, we've kind of reached the end of the presentation, but we can just open it up for questions now if you guys are comfortable with that.
Yep.
All right, for anyone attending, if you want to drop questions in the Q&A, if you have any others, or if we didn't answer anything well or clear enough, please restate the question or let us know. I did have one other by email that I can ask to both Danielle and Eileen. What if my school does not create or send a progress report at all?
That would be alarming. I would hope that they maybe have the progress report, they just didn't send it to you. So my hope would be that if you requested, they could dig into your child's file and find them. I mean, I've never heard of a district not doing one. It just maybe they forgot to send it to you. So that would be my hope. If you ask them and they said, no, we don't have one, I don't even know where to go from there, honestly.
Yeah, I would echo everything Danielle said. I mean, it is a procedural violation for them to not send it. But what is that? Sure, it's a procedural violation. But what does that really mean? You still want the data. So hopefully they would be able to dig that up for you and, get it to you late better than never, I think.
Right.
Because like Danielle mentioned in her presentation, it's going to guide a whole lot of other things. So you really, definitely ask. You really want it.
And one other by email, if is ESY and compensatory education, can they both be required?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because I feel like they're measuring two different things. The ESY is looking at regression, recoupment, or lack of growth, and Comp Ed again is looking at the district's inability to provide appropriate services to your child. So they're two different things. And again, I would argue then provide the Comp Ed during the school year and ESY over the summer.
I agree with all of that. They absolutely can be both required depending on the specific situation your child is in.
With that question by ESY, you can request an IEP team meeting at any point in time. So you absolutely can request a meeting and talk about ESY and request ESY. A lot of times districts will say, well, let's re-meet in April or May and have that conversation. And that's okay because they want to collect data. I guess my concern is usually when they come to the table and say we don't have enough data. So if you feel like your child may need ESY, then I would ensure that data is collected in the spring before they leave for summer break. And then of course, when they get back in the fall and then throughout the school year. So if you feel like that may be something your child's going to need or require, then just again, request that data is being collected throughout their time.
Got it. Now this one's a little tricky, but it says, since our district didn't offer online schooling for this year and we are homeschooling, can we request ESY for the summer of 2022? First, I think the first response would be you'd have to re-enroll to begin with for the school district to be at all, in any case, obligated to provide ESY. And then, I don't know, I'm thinking a little bit about, because they didn't provide, I got to go back to the question, they did not provide online schooling.
I think the school district would argue that they would not be able to tell a true picture of your child's progress because they weren't the one providing the instruction. So they wouldn't know the breadth and depth of that instruction. So I think a district would argue that lack of progress would not actually be able to be measured by them because they're not the ones who provided the instruction. I'm just putting my mind in the district. I think that's what they would say. Yeah,
and once they're re-enrolled and they can establish a baseline, I think then, and if you're not making progress, but it would take some time to both establish the baseline and then see what progress is made, if any, and then you might have a basis for it.
Yeah.
And then, is there a formal process to request ESY for your child, or does this have to be recommended by the school?
Yeah, I think I just addressed that one.
Got a couple others here. My child is in crisis, has been removed from school. He has an IEP. How can I get help? Well, a couple resources: Disability Rights Ohio, OCECD. Both are great resources. You can also hire, private advocate or attorney, but they're thankfully through those two organizations, there are free resources to use, especially if your child's in crisis and removed from school. That is a situation where if they're not receiving an education, that is, I would say, very urgent. And either through the information specialist at OCECD or the advocates and attorneys at DRO, I think you could probably get to the right place. Next question. For those homeschooling for COVID safety who need special education, perhaps a public online charter school would be something to consider.
Absolutely.
That's an option. And public, also called community schools in Ohio, they do have an obligation to, they have obligations under IDEA just like public schools do. So that is a consideration. You just have to figure out whether those schools, which are sometimes tailored for specific academic or other purposes, whether or not that's a good fit, and whether you think you got to ask a lot of questions about whether they can service your child with a disability, and whether you believe that they will do a good job at it.
Yeah, definitely ask a lot of questions. If you're going to be in an online charter school, I think we've seen some issues in the past. So definitely ask a lot of questions, how the services are going to be provided, how that's all going to be measured. But that can be a good option to keep your kid online, but at the same time, online at home, and but still entitled to a free appropriate public education.
Yeah. And again, you can always use scholarship funds too to pay for therapy. So if you are comfortable with providing the academic support to your child via homeschool, you can also use the John Peterson Scholarship or Autism Scholarship to get outside speech, OT, or even specific reading supports as well.
Yeah, I think it might be helpful too. So options, with homeschooling and the scholarship to provide, the instruction for homeschooling in particular would be led by you or a teacher. But and then the services could be, the cost of the services could be covered, and hiring of service providers could be covered through either of the scholarships. But I think most everyone understands when you accept those scholarships, then the local school district's no longer responsible for provision of FAPE. But it's still the needs could be met through a private provider or a private school. You can't use the funds for a community school or a charter school. That's kind of a separate consideration. So if you enroll in a community school, which is also again a public school, they do have obligations under IDEA, and that's without, they don't get paid through the scholarship. They get paid just like a traditional public school would. The funds are just redirected. So there are a couple of opportunities, and then to make it more confusing, most of the online schools, the purely online schools in Ohio that exist, are community schools, but not all community schools are online schools. So there are some bricks and mortar community schools that are options that are required to meet the obligations of IDEA. And then the online charter schools are also, again, charter/community schools, also have those obligations under IDEA. So technically speaking, they are required to service and provide the services under the IEP for community school. And then for private school, you can either pay privately or use the scholarships if you're eligible. What can you do if the school teacher is expecting a child to already be operating at the level of the end of the IEP goals?
I mean, I guess I would question maybe the IEP goal isn't appropriate. Maybe your child is performing above what they initially measured your child to be at. Or maybe that's just an expectation of the teacher that's not appropriate for your child.
Yeah, the objectives should clear that up. I mean, what is the objective this semester or this quarter? And then if the objective is to, you should, obviously the objective shouldn't be to be meeting the goal. It should be making progress towards to meeting the goal. So either the goal has to be changed or the teacher's expectations have to be changed.
Right. Also, the objective should not be the goal. Just saying. I see that a lot, especially when you have like 3 objectives and the third one is the same one as the goal. Like that's not an objective to reach the goal. That's just the goal restated in a separate area. So make sure that the objectives are the small little pieces to reach the goal. Or again, if it's a benchmark, then the small steps to reach the goal. It shouldn't be a repeat of the goal.
Good point. Let's see. Here we go. What if a school district has removed a service from a student's IEP during the pandemic and has not considered the impact of COVID-19? I would start by saying, why did they remove it? And if it wasn't because the student reached the goal, then I think, and there's still a need there, you got to put it back. And then they have to consider the impact of COVID-19. And if they're not, I would use the document that I just referenced, Return to School Roadmap, as guidance directly from the Department of Education that indicates very clearly that they have to consider the impact of COVID-19, what services were lost, the social and emotional impact, the mental health impact, all of those things, whether or not the present levels are still accurate. They absolutely have to consider those things, and it's just not debatable.
And they may have to collect some additional baseline data. Like I'm thinking to myself, if your child had a behavior goal, but when they were at home, they weren't showing those behaviors, so the district removed that goal. Now your child's back in school exhibiting those behaviors again. And maybe the district just needs to collect some baseline data to even know where to start from. And that's okay. Or you can do an FBA, which would be separate from a goal. But again, if you make the request though, I would have a specific timeline in mind. Like you want to re-meet in 4 to 6 weeks, you will have the conversation. But that may be so that maybe you just need to have some additional data collected.
Right. I would really encourage anyone to print out that document with the roadmap, because again, it shouldn't really be an argument that they're considering these things when you're amending or updating the IEP. Good question, though.
Yeah, I agree with Mark on that, especially, you know, like Mark, Danielle and I, we might stay up to date on those kind of guidance, you know, as part of our jobs, but down at the school level, that doesn't, maybe takes longer for the information to get there. And sometimes they're like, who is this parent telling me, you know, what if you show them this nice little guidance, give it to them before the meeting, say, look, you know, this the U.S. Department of Education has said, this is not, you know, my opinion as a parent. That can be really powerful and a great advocacy tool for you as a parent.
And it's easy enough to Google, you know, back to school roadmap, USDOE, or again, you can go to the Legal Clinic site and click on resources, and it's there available for you. I think that's the end of our questions. Any others before we end?
I think the same person who asked about the teachers' expectations had a follow-up question about how the teachers' expectations can be changed. I don't know if there's a good answer to that question.
I think data.
Yeah,
right?
With data, I think ask for an IEP meeting and talk about your concerns, talk about the data. Could just be that the teacher, you know, it's going to require a conversation, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's almost it should be objective. So, you know, if you're looking at the goals and the objectives, and the teacher's expecting the student to be, you know, have met the goal mid-school year, but the objective is to get halfway there, I don't know that that's able to be argued. I just don't, you know, how a teacher can look you in the eye. I can't imagine either, you know, the teacher's not getting the right information or isn't informed about what the IEP says. I can't imagine that that's just that unreasonable, because that doesn't happen very often. I mean,
right. Or again, if the IEP goal was written and your child has made a lot of progress, and so that teacher sees them performing at that goal level. So yeah, I think there could be a lot of things at play. Absolutely.
Yeah, right. And then you're right. If the student is meeting the goal, and that's why the teacher expects it, then there should be some data for her to support her position.
Yeah,
that's what she expects. But then the goal should be amended so that we're pushing the child forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, and along that same line, real quick, you know, with Andrew F, that came out in, was it 2017? But if your child has met that goal, then that goal needs to be rewritten. Don't keep with that goal through the whole entire school year. I see that, unfortunately, a lot. Or even the objectives. If they've met all the objectives or most of the objectives, and they're working on one small little piece, maybe amending the IEP to add some new objectives. Always, you know, feel free to request that meeting and talk about what's best for your child. Because again, I just got one last week, and it was like met, and the IEP is due like in March. So I'm like, well, let's have a meeting then and talk about how we can update these IEP goals, because if he's met them, that's great. But let's see what else we can work on. So don't ever let your child just kind of float by if they've already met the goals.
Good question that came in. Can the district ask your child to attend a different school? I think the answer falls in why they're asking. So there can be occasions where it made the most appropriate education under IDEA would be for an outside placement. So through a private placement or a service provider. So in some cases, they may ask for that reason, because they're not able to provide all the services. They still have obligations under IDEA, so don't get me wrong. Now, if they're asking, you know, for you to just go to a different district, not talking about outside placement, or like they don't want you there for behavior, or they don't want you there because it's too tedious, then that's inappropriate. But they may suggest an outside placement, although it's ultimately your choice to go with that placement or not. You are entitled as a resident of the district to attend in that district, whether or not they think it's, you know, they're servicing you, you know, 100% accurately.
Well, if they're asking for your child to go to a different school, then they're paying for that school. So if they're saying your child needs to go to a different placement, then they need to be footing that bill. So they can't just ask you to voluntarily send your child somewhere else. I mean, if they're
Yeah,
saying you're
important
gonna
point.
go somewhere else.
Right.
And I see the question about the alternate assessment. So the alternate assessment, the state of Ohio says that 1% of students, 1% or less of students in a district should be taking the alternate assessment. So what they came out with guidance over this past summer, or was it last year? Gosh.
Anyway, it started last fall, but yeah, it's relatively new.
So recently, they came out with this new sort of flow chart. It used to be the flow chart. I mean, you could easily read it. You could, yes, no, does your child need alternate assessment? This one is very detailed, very specific questions, looking at your child's cognitive ability, their adaptive behavior, their academic skills. And so I've had children that I currently work with that I think would benefit more from the alternate assessment, and they don't qualify for it. Because the child really has to be struggling significantly in the school setting. So unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of kids who are going to be in that gray area where there's very small percentage of those kids are going to pass that regular assessment, but they don't qualify for the alternate assessment. So I think the school is, or I'm sorry, I think the state is just really trying to be more strict on who qualifies for the alternate assessment. But it's a really small percentage of kids who do qualify.
Danielle is absolutely correct. I think everything she said, and ODE and the Ohio Department of Education is really trying to crack down on how many kids are taking the alternate assessment, because Ohio has historically had above 1% of students taking the alternate assessment, and that's not supposed to be happening. So they're trying to rein it back in. And yeah, unfortunately, that's for a lot of kids, who may have historically always qualified for the alternate assessment, under this stricter guidance may not be able to.
I want to go back to one question because I thought of an additional point that I think is worth making. So someone mentioned their district doesn't offer online school, just in person, which is true, I think, for some districts, especially some rural ones. Although a lot more districts added an online option, at the start of the 2021 school year. So if the reason that your child can't go to school or attend school in person is because of their own medical susceptibility or predisposition or some other disability related reason, then there may be a requirement. It's a case on a case-by-case basis, but there may be a requirement for that school to deliver the education in a way that doesn't put the child at risk. So that may be online, that may be home instruction, that may be Zooming into the classroom. You can in some cases obligate districts to provide the education in an alternate way or an alternate setting. If it's because of the child's own susceptibility or disability. There are situations where the parents have some susceptibilities, and some districts are accommodating to that, but they don't have a requirement for the parents. They only have a requirement for the student. We have been successful in some cases where the parents are predisposed, but if it is for the child's own, medical reason, then I think you have a good case to, whether that's one-to-one tutoring, either in the home or, in a room, with the child and the tutor, so that they're not in the group setting. There are options, and the school will have to consider those for the child's own disability. I think that's the end. Let's see. Yeah, we'll give it another 15 seconds or so, and then assuming we don't get any other questions. Well, thanks, Danielle, and thanks, Eileen, for taking the time on a Saturday morning to do this.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. And for anyone who had a individual guidance session scheduled, those will start at 11 and then another one at 11:30. And you should have received a link by email. You did receive a link by email. So you'll have those with either me, Danielle, or Eileen at 11 and 11:30. Otherwise, have a good Saturday and weekend. And thank you to everyone who attended.